Thank you so much, Andy, for having me here and to all of you for being here. So I'm going to talk about data for decisions and thinking about impact. And basically, going to take a more positive view than the two men before me have taken, which is, I think I'm much more optimistic about how data can be used. And I completely concur with Santosh when he says that, as well as with Andy, when he says that, look, there's a lot of data and what we need are insights. So I'm going to start with some of my own personal as well as organizational experience on data being used for decision making. Just by way of introduction, I represent the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, also called 3IE by a lot of people. And 3IE is an organization that supports evidence, high quality evidence that's policy relevant in the area of development decision making. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to concentrate on policy making and organizational thinking. Yeah? Moving very quickly, this is my first example of big data for policy making. And it's particularly, I thought I'd use this example primarily because climate change is a big, big question that a lot of people have questions about as to what can influence climate change. And one of the policies that people use to reduce climate change is forests, right? Forests are one of the largest sinks of greenhouse gas emissions, and they are encouraged a lot by a lot of policymakers. So this is some of the important questions that I use or ask in the area of forests are really do programs that are set up for reducing climate change, such as forestry programs, do they actually work? Do they help to actually reduce deforestation, for example? The secondary questions become really important. Do protected areas, for example, or national parks and things or policies that are used to increase the level of forests in the world, do they actually always reduce deforestation? Second, do they reduce deforestation to the extent that we would know that deforestation would not have occurred in the absence of these policies? So are they actually being additional? And if they are being additional, then how much and what is the quantity of that reduction? And last but not least, if there is a reduction, what is the amount of trade-offs that you're usually dealing with? And this is pretty standard. Most questions that are asked in the area of deforestation have to deal with the questions of trade-offs. If you're not letting people who are dependent on forests go into forests, then what is the trade-off that they are having to bear in terms of their own livelihoods? Okay, so this is work that I did when I was at the World Bank, and this is the map of Thailand. And I was asked, so this was data that was provided by NASA. And at that time, one of the big initiatives under the Land Use, Land Cover Change initiatives was to find out as to what are the big drivers of deforestation. In Thailand, most protected areas that have to preserve or prevent deforestation, are located in North Thailand. So if you look at this is about 170,000 square kilometers. That's where most protected areas are located. It's also the area where most national parks and sanctuaries are located, not surprisingly. Okay, so all of this is very nice, but then let's see where are forest programs located. Yeah? And this is basically taken a zoomed out picture of northern Thailand, and that's essentially 170,000 square kilometers. And if you see these boundaries, these are all areas that are national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. All very nice. The grey and the dark grey areas are showing elevation. So the flat area is low elevation, and the darker grey areas are higher and higher elevation. The one thing that I want you to notice is that most forests, most protected areas are located in areas that are dark grey, which means these are high elevation. So most protected areas are located in areas that are high elevation areas. Yeah? So they are remote, and that's where you find most of the forest. This is all very nice. So basically, the areas that are flat are the ones that are cleared. The areas that are not flat and are high elevation, high slope, are the ones where you have most of your protected areas. So what does that mean? It means that most of the areas that are getting protected, because they are the ones that have forests, are the ones that are located on high elevations. Yeah? They are also the ones that have, therefore, low agricultural profitability and productivity. Because they are far off, people and farmers don't find it useful to actually get from those, to actually clear those areas, and that's where forests are located. All very nice. So forest programs are located in these areas. So when you're looking at the effectiveness of forest programs, you get into account for the fact that these are located in areas that have low agricultural profitability. Yeah? This is called bias of program placement. It says that, look, intuitively, even in the absence of these forestry programs, you wouldn't actually see a lot of deforestation occurring in these areas, because the profitability of clearing forests is actually quite low. Okay, in Brazil, these are called paper parks. Yeah? So the fact that you're actually putting down programs in areas where you wouldn't see a lot of deforestation anyway, and you say that your programs are successful. So, areas with high elevation, slopes and bad soils are where protected areas are located. So, do protected areas then truly reduce the amount of deforestation that they say they are? Yeah? Okay, so, and if they are, then how much? Okay, so then I used, and this is the big data part of the work, and that is why I thought it was interesting, is that I used a layer, a GIS layer, which had about 7 layers in it. And I used data that was taken, all of it was free, all of it is open source, and all of it I could essentially use because it's available, just by writing to the agency. So this is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They gave me data on protected area boundaries. There's also data on elevation, which is the digital elevation model, and you can actually go online and find this data. At that time, the resolution of this data was, I think, 100 square meters, but now it's reduced hugely. I mean, it's really fantastic data now. I also got the roads data as well as forest data from NASA actually, and they had released all of this data because they didn't know what to do with it after the Cold War dissolved. So, using all of this, I essentially created a GIS and then put a grid on top. And this grid, imagine that every square is a pixel. That pixel represents 100 square meters on the ground. It generated a data set of 26 million points. I didn't have computing power to deal with 26 million points. So we then sampled systematically at a distance of 5 kilometers, starting from the top left corner, and got 6,500 or so data points. And then used that to then essentially run what's called a quasi-experimental model to then understand, and I'm not going to go into the details of that, but then to understand that protected areas, after you account for this placement bias, actually have very little effect on land clearing. And the coefficient there is 0.077, and it's almost close to 0. Yeah? So basically, the next part of this was to then see, okay, how can we use this data set to then see what are the areas that are really being threatened as a consequence of deforestation. And so the yellow pixels there are the areas that have more than 0.5 probability of getting deforested. These were then presented to policymakers within the bank as well as within the bank. Okay, so big results. Naively, if you're looking at this, protection has a large effect, but if you use big data, and again, the big data was really important to see what the patterns were and the biases were. Yeah? You can see that there is, at least in this cross section, no effect. Yeah? So that's my first result. The second one is I'm going to look at data for organizational strategy. And I'm really looking at the case of 3IE. And this is basically experience that we used over the past 3.5 years. The first one is where 3IE is an organization that does a lot of its work through grants. So we have these grant programs that then go on to support specific areas of research and evidence generation. Yeah? So the first question is, well, how do we decide where to support the evidence generation? I mean, you can look at the SDGs. There's 17 SDGs. There are more than 300 targets. If we started to look at just about everything, I don't think we'd stop even if we live, a million years. So clearly, we need to look at what is the data and what is the evidence that's available, and then see where are the gaps. So we do this by mapping evidence through what are called evidence gap maps. Yeah? And evidence gap maps essentially look like this. On the horizontal, we essentially plot all of the outcomes, and on the vertical, we plot all of the interventions, say within humanitarian assistance. So if you know the theory of change of humanitarian assistance work, you plot all of the outcomes there as well as the impact indicators, and along the vertical axis, you put all of the interventions that you think are directed towards reducing the effects of humanitarian conflict. And then the cells basically show as to where most of the data is, or most of the evidence is. Okay? And we've used these evidence gap maps now for a whole variety of development subsectors. And what this has generated for us is the big learning that if you look at big areas of development, especially where a lot of investment has taken place, humanitarian assistance, from 1995 to 2005, $100 billion was invested in humanitarian assistance. What's the amount of high-quality evidence that's been produced in that area? Less than 50 studies. Transparency and accountability. Again, just illustratively, in Africa, the potential for transparency and accountability in just natural resource governance is $333 billion. This is just natural resources. What is the number of studies that we think are high quality can be used for decision making? 0. Yeah. So these are essentially what we are then using to then understand where we can direct our own evidence programs. Okay, second, Sherlock Holmes was right. Yeah? So, and what do I want to say here? That in a lot of cases, we know that implementation failure is very, very big. This is an example of cook stoves. A lot of you know this, that one of the evidence, one of the grants that we, well, not grants, but quite a few of the grants that 3IE has supported has actually found that a lot of the studies, although they are trying to and aiming to understand impact and measuring it, actually implementation failure occurs very, very quickly, which has meant that we have introduced, therefore, pilots looking at implementation fidelity and therefore introduced preparation grants, which precede the larger impact evaluation grants that we give. Yeah? Third, so essentially the learning, we introduced implementation fidelity tracking. That's really important and critical now, and also preparation grants. Third, participation. So I was really interested in looking at the extent to which developing country researchers participate in the studies that we are supporting through our grants. And we found that actually, and again, we did a whole lot of analysis, what is accepted, what is rejected, what are the policy scores, what are the technical scores, etc. And we found that most, at least till 2014, in a lot of the studies, developing country researchers were playing only very, very minor roles in these studies. Yeah, go get the data, and essentially the analysis and the nice strategic thinking was being done by developed country researchers who are essentially coming in. Now here's an opportunity where there is an opportunity for a huge amount of leapfrogging. You can work together, learn from each other, developed country researchers who are coming from outside can learn about contextual issues and sector issues from developing country researchers. And developing country researchers, vice versa, can learn a lot in terms of techniques and methods from a lot of developed country researchers. Here's an opportunity. In our own work, we therefore have, I'm sorry, that was not the lesson. We have actually made compulsory developing country researcher presence in all of our grants that we give out. So they are required to be present as important and substantive members of the team. Last but not least, Murphy's Law is real. Yeah? So if you looked at, just 3IE's grants, we analyzed 3IE's grants almost at the point that I did this analysis, this was about 90 grants that we were looking at. And we found basically that more than 1/4 of our grants were delayed by more than a year. This is all very good, but clearly it doesn't look very good for us. So we essentially then tracked a lot of these grants and tried to see as to where is most of our failure occurring. And we realized that a lot of it was external, but a lot of it is also internal, that we can undertake a lot of action to then understand as to how we can nudge our partners, who are evaluation partners, to then do better. And what we basically did was that we planned for timelines, again using data that I'm not going over, but we planned for timelines which is approximately about 3.5 years for these impact evaluations, if not more. And second, we introduced reminders which are automatic, as well as organization lead supported letters. If our evaluation teams are delayed, then they have to send us letters that are signed by the head of the organization to explain the delay. So that will put a little bit of pressure also on the evaluation teams to then be much more on time. Okay, so conclusions. Just to say that yes, data works. Clearly, I think, and this is really important, I think that we do need to think about what the incentives are for using data, for providing those insights. In both of these cases, clearly the incentives work very much for us to use this data to generate insights and to learn from them and to employ them very, very actively. Just to go back to one of Santoshi's points as well, and we took exactly the data that Santosh is talking about in sanitation, that 9 million toilets have been used, but actually usage of toilets is less than 50%, so it is actually 45%, and ODF, or open defecation, rates in India are the highest in the world. In fact, it accounts for more than 60% of the total open defecation in the world. Yeah? And so we're starting an entire new program of evidence, which is looking at what can increase latrine use in India, especially in rural areas. But again, that's another example of using data for better decision making. Okay, so policy change, and we also talked about organizational change, and just to recap all 4 of those points. Filling the data gap, filling the evidence gap, data for introducing implementation fidelity and preparation grants, increasing the role of developing country researchers, as well as, reducing delays in our own programs. Thank you.